Thank you so much for your presence here today. Let's start with a brief prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Gracious God, we ask your blessings upon Dr. Camosy as he prepares to speak to us about the gift of human life from the Catholic tradition. We ask for healing of division in our country, that we might learn once again to walk with one another, work together with one another, to build and uphold a culture that promotes all human life, and even in ways in which might be difficult for us to do with those who may disagree with us on things. We can work together to find common respect for each other. We ask all of this in Christ's name, amen. Well, my name is Father Bob Basic. I'm the pastor here at St. Gerard. Thank you so much for your coming. Very honored to have with us today Dr. Charlie Camosy. Dr. Camosy is a professor of medical humanities at Creighton University School of Medicine. He also holds the Monsignor Curran Fellowship in Moral Theology at St. Joseph's Seminary in New York. He's a sought-after speaker, writer, both in journals and then also books, many of which I have and enjoy reading. I heard him speak about abortion on the radio, and I said, that's the voice that I want my people at St. Gerard to hear. And so when Roe was overturned with the Dobbs decision, I said it would be great if we could bring him to St. Gerard. And I said, there's no way he's going to be able to come to St. Gerard with this fall and how crazy everything is, but I tried, I asked, and you know what, he said yes, and it worked out, and he's here today. We're so very blessed to have him here. We also are blessed to have Sister Marie Paul, who is a local physician here in our community at Cristo Rey, and she is a member of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, who are a blessing to our diocese and beyond. Sister Marie Paul is going to assist Dr. Camosy with a question and answer period if there's something that could be more properly or precisely addressed by a physician. So Dr. Camosy is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period after that. Welcome, Charlie Camosy. Also, I just wanted to remind you or tell you that we are recording tonight's event, and starting tomorrow, it will be available for other people to see and to share. So we're hopeful that this message will go far beyond the people that are gathered here today. But I did want you to know that in case you didn't want to ask a question and be recorded. If that's the case and you'd like me to ask your question for you, you can find me in the back. Thank you.
So great to see all of you here. I suspect that we wouldn't have as many people here if the state score were different at the moment. Is that fair to say? At a different time in my life, based on football loyalties alone, this would kind of be wading into enemy territory for me. I grew up in Wisconsin, so I'm a big Badger fan. And I did all three of my degrees at Notre Dame. In fact, I was just mentioning to Trish that one of my favorite experiences from undergrad was coming up here to see Notre Dame play MSU in 1994, I think it was. So it's a long time ago. But we're that ridiculous Notre Dame family in our house. My parents met on a train going to see Notre Dame play Alabama in the Sugar Bowl in 1972. So. No jokes, please, about that being the last time we beat Alabama in a meaningful game. But after 15 years or so of living in the New York City metropolitan area, I have to say thank you to Father Bob for inviting me to a place that feels very much like home, being from the upper Midwest myself, and checking out some places that really feel like fall. Midwest fall is here, and that's a glorious place and time to be. Thanks also to Father Bob for having the courage to organize something like this. In my area of the country, pastors are generally too afraid to do something like this or to even mention the issue in a homily. But it comes from a deep sense that he cares about his flock so much that he's planned something like this despite the headaches and complaints which come before, during, and after these kinds of things. So thank you for your courage and care for your flock, Father Bob. Now, if one were to compile a top 10 list of statements that are most true right now, I think the claim that very little good happens on Twitter would be a strong candidate for that top 10. And by the way, if you have any ideas how I can do my job as a public moral theologian and bioethicist without being on Twitter, I want to talk to you after the talk. But a few days ago, I saw something so good on Twitter, I guess the exception which proves the rule, that I thought I'd open my talk with you in quoting it. It came from a woman I know who is recounting how her pastor opened a homily in which he was going to preach on the topic tonight that I'm speaking on tonight. He said, quote, "If abortion has touched your life, please know you are so welcome here. You and I are here because we need mercy. If I say anything to make you feel unloved, please talk to me so I can make it right." End quote. And this is my opening message to you as well. And though I have to go to dinner with Father Bob at some reasonable hour tonight, please know I will stay and talk with you after the even formal question and answer as long as I can, if you have any interest in doing so. Abortion has touched so many people, including several people close to me. I mean, think about this. The number of abortions since Roe versus Wade dwarfs the number of people killed in the Nazi Holocaust many times over. That is a gargantuan amount of largely hidden and buried pain, much of which I think we've seen resurface in very raw ways over the last few months. And I would say if pro-lifers cannot make mercy for those touched by abortion a central part of what we're about, it's my view that we have virtually no chance of reaching our goals, to say nothing of even becoming minimally decent Christians. But one of the things I've loved about all three popes of my lifetime, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Pope Francis, is that while none of them shrank from speaking the truth, they all spoke it primarily with pastoral love and mercy as their concern. And again, I will do my best this evening to similarly speak the truth in love. And here's one truth to lead with right off the bat. Pregnancy involves an unimaginably intimate relationship between two human beings. In other contexts, we know this very well, don't we? Obviously, the pregnant woman is a human being, but whenever we use the phrase baby bump or baby shower, we acknowledge that it's two we're talking about. Whenever surgery is performed on the developed organs and systems of an unborn child, we acknowledge this. Whenever new parents excitingly learn about the heartbeat of their new baby, and by the way, the OBGYN always calls him or her a baby when they're wanted, we acknowledge it then too, despite the kind of anti-science rhetoric out there about it not being a heart at 6 weeks. I'm not sure what to call this four-chambered thing pumping blood. Let's think about what we should call it. But the move to change our language, to hide the dignity of the prenatal child, and make her easier to discard, is a classic example of what Pope Francis calls throwaway culture. And Pope Francis has been extremely clear about what abortion is. It is killing, he says. Let's not mince words. Indeed, when thinking about killing a prenatal human being because she has a disability, He used some of the most hardcore language I've heard any pope use about abortion ever. You remember when he called it akin to a white-collar Nazi crime? Pope Francis is known, I guess, for being a lefty pope or liberal pope in some circles, but nothing like that was ever said by John Paul II or Benedict XVI about abortion. And yes, no one can boast a more consistent life ethic than does the Holy Father. I wrote a whole book on his consistent life ethic, which I titled Resisting Throwaway Culture. And he dedicated a year of mercy to women who've had abortions, and in doing so imitated Christ, obviously, naming the bad things for what they are, but making clear God's mercy is present in reaching out pastorally. If Pope Francis is right, that prenatal children bear the face of Christ in a special way, particularly because they're vulnerable and voiceless and marginalized, the least among us, then it is clear we need to speak up for them. It is clear we must protect them. Indeed, it is clear they need to be defended like other kinds of children under the law. That is what justice requires, equal justice under law. To fail to do this would be the worst kind of arbitrary discrimination, the kind of arbitrary discrimination which has led to so much injustice in the past, especially to racial minorities, women, people who identify as gay or lesbian, the list goes on and on. This is not a matter of exclusively religious dogma, but again, what secular justice demands, the equal treatment of all human beings under the law. But one of the things that pro-lifers sometimes fail to fully appreciate is just how unlike the relationships, typical relationships, the mother-child relationship is in a pregnancy. Mother and child share an organ, right? They share an organ, the placenta. The relationship is so intimate, if you needed more than that for evidence of its radical intimacy, the mother and child even exchange cellular material that lives on in the body of the mother well after birth, sometimes well after a miscarriage. This kind of intimacy is one of the reasons some theologians have used pregnancy as a kind of analogy to describe God's intimate relationship with us, right? God's relationship with us is so powerfully intimate that maybe the best thing we can come up with as an analogy is a relationship between a mother and her baby. Now, under normal circumstances in a pregnancy, it's usually fairly straightforward to care for both, mother and baby. But especially when the mother's life or serious health is at risk, it can be much, much more difficult. And a woman has a right to bodily integrity as a means of defending herself in this regard. And if she wants to, she should absolutely have the right to have procedures done aimed at saving her life, even if it means she foresees that the baby will likely die as an unintended side effect. And that's actually the teaching of the Catholic Church. If you didn't know, hopefully we know. There's lots of talk today about ectopic pregnancies and hysterectomies and lots of other things. The teaching of the Catholic Church is that we save the life of the mother, and we should be absolutely clear about that, especially in today's environment. There are a lot of people who misuse concern for women's health, which has to be the highest priority for us, treating mother and child the same, right? But who use that concern to go beyond things that involve what most people would understand as being about women's health. And you can see that when you look at especially 3 countries that have largely protected prenatal justice under law, and see what their outcomes are like for women. Many of you know that until fairly recently, Ireland protected prenatal justice in their constitution. You know that they had wildly better outcomes for women maternal health, maternal mortality, maternal morbidity than their neighbor England, despite England having so much abortion, like abortion upon abortion on abortion. Ireland had better health outcomes for women. Now, it's true that some Irish did travel to England and Germany and other places to get abortions, but not enough to explain that. Chile, a few years ago, banned most abortions and saw their health outcomes for women get better. Where does that fit in our current narrative? Poland protects most prenatal children under law. They have the best maternal health in all of Europe. The best, number one. So don't tell me that we can't love and protect both prenatal children and protect and support their mothers at the same time. We can, we do, happens all the time. And indeed, the church has had this focus on vulnerable populations wherever we find them, consistently across the board from the very beginning. Some of you may have heard at some point in your education about a document called the Didache. It's one of the earliest documents we have in the church. Scholars debate amongst themselves how old it is, how does it relate to the Gospels, etc. But everyone agrees it's one of the earliest documents we have. The Didache was very intentional about contrasting the way of life versus the way of death, and explicitly saying that not only abortion, but infanticide were to not be practiced by Christians by making that distinction. In fact, maybe you know that in the ancient world of that time, basically infanticide was like we use abortion today. It was used basically as a method of birth control. In fact, we have this amazing papyrus still left over from the year 1. There's this guy named Hilarion, I think is how you say his name. He was a migrant worker in Alexandria writing his pregnant wife Alice. And the letter basically says, hey baby, I love you, I miss you. If the guys come home before me, don't worry, I'm gonna continue to stay working in Alexandria for a while. And I'll send you the money when I get it. I miss you, take care of our already born child, and she's pregnant, so he says, if you have the baby while I'm gone, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, throw it out. So here's this amazing letter that is actually very warm and caring. He cares very much about his wife and their already born child, but infanticide was just an afterthought in the ancient world. Christians, we know from the Didache and other places, stood up directly against that culture of death, the way of death. But then they make another important move in the Didache to say that the way of life is contrasted with the way of death, not only with how they treat prenatal and neonatal human beings, but also especially the poor. And how could you not come to that conclusion if you just listen to what Jesus had to say, right? The way of death includes the unjust judges of the poor who exploit the poor. And so if pro-lifers focus only on prenatal children, we miss an essential part of what it means to be pro-life from the very beginnings. That's not to downplay, obviously, infanticide or abortion, far from it. I think the US bishops are totally correct to say this has to be the preeminent priority if we're going to talk about the mass death we're talking about here and the harm it does to women. But from the very beginnings, we had a consistent life ethic that combined concern for violence against vulnerable prenatal and neonatal human life with a concern for the poor. And I can see the pro-life movement now changing on this in the United States. I think I see pro-lifers moving in the direction quite different from the kind of libertarian, small government approach of the 80s and 90s and embracing a more holistic view that's more like the Didache, one that combines a concern with violence against prenatal human beings with a concern for the poor and the vulnerable, the economically vulnerable. And let me gently challenge those of you who may think that economic and concerns about economic justice and racial justice means we need to support abortion rights. On the contrary, Gallup finds time and time again that people who are poor, who are economically vulnerable, and especially who are economically vulnerable people of color, are more pro-life, more anti-abortion than those who are economically privileged and who are white. But then think about this. Abortions in these very communities happen at just a monstrously high rate. I taught in the Bronx at Fordham University for 14 years. During that time, the abortion rate in the Bronx of all pregnancies hovered between 42 and 47% of all pregnancies. It's one of the poorest places in the country. Not surprising. One of the most racially diverse places, right? Well, maybe not even diverse, certainly not, we just say it, not white places in the country. I don't know what it's like here or in Detroit, but in New York City, did you know that the abortion rate for black babies is over 50%? I hang out with the Sisters of Life in New York a lot, and I heard a story from them recently about a young Hispanic girl who got care in a local hospital and had an abortion performed on her without her consent. She didn't know she was having an abortion. You add onto these horrors that a high percentage, we're not totally clear how high, but very high percentage of abortions take place in the context of intimate partner violence. This especially is the case when there's a woman that's had more than one abortion. A truly consistent ethic of life should see structural racism, structural poverty, intimate partner violence, and abortion in a matrix of injustice together. And then think about this again. The people who are most pro-life, poor people of color, they're the ones who know best of any demographic group in this country that abortion is a killing of a child. They have far and away the most abortions. That's a diabolical situation and one that we need to confront head on. And this should not be political, right? It should absolutely not be political. Especially if we're going to be Catholic about this rather than have an idolatrous focus on politics. I have, in the past, divided the pro-life movement into 3 stages in the United States. Pro-life 1.0, one might say, began even before Roe versus Wade was a thing. In fact, it was an incredibly diverse, politically diverse group of folks. People all over the political spectrum identified as pro-life. In fact, there was a very, very strong wing of the pro-life movement at this time that was also very strongly anti-war, anti-Vietnam War. So much so that they would go to the anti-war movements and burn their draft cards, and then they go to the anti-abortion movements and burn their birth certificates. Actually, it's probably more accurate to say they discarded their birth certificates. I like to think of them burning. But why would they discard them or burn them? It was because this tool of government oppression, this document which arbitrarily says when you matter, when human beings matter, also needed to be discarded. I just love that image, right? I just love that image. In part because it's been hard to imagine it over the last 40 years or so, right? Given how our politics have moved. And by the way, if you'd like, there are many, many stories about this. If you find that as fascinating as I do, or even half as fascinating as I do, there's this great book by Daniel K. Williams called Defenders of the Unborn. He's a great historian, and he documents all of this. But then about the time of the Reagan Revolution, and we had something called fusionism, where you had kind of small government libertarians fuse with kind of neoconservative, anti-communist war hawks and nuclear war hawks even, and the moral majority and Jerry Falwell and pro-lifers and all that kind of came together in this, what they call the three-legged stool of conservatism that's kind of been around for maybe the last 40 years or so. And you could probably tell my bias about this. I think that was not exactly the best thing for the pro-life movement, but it's what we prudentially had to go with at the time. Happily now, that three-legged stool is broken. That no longer exists. We're in the middle of a very, very different political situation at the moment. In fact, it's not even clear, right, what the Republican Party even is, or in some cases what the Democratic Party even is. But more, I think, Republicans. In fact, maybe you know, in the last election cycle, there was not even a platform, right? There was no platform. So I think we're ripe for something like pro-life 3.0. So if 1.0 was, you know, kind of the defenders, the unborn, this eclectic mix of very different people, different ideas, and 2.0 was the kind of three-legged stool fusionism, we're ripe for something new and interesting and I think very exciting that can better witness to the fullness of the church's teaching on what it means to be pro-life, not just broadly across the board. I mean, we can have discussions about just war theory and all sorts of things, but even just I'm focusing mostly on attacking abortion from every angle, right? From every angle possible. And it used to be very difficult to do that, given the three-legged stool and how it worked out. We are now in a very different, and in my view, much more hopeful place when it comes to that. Significantly, this movement, though I think we absolutely should try to change the minds of people who think prenatal children ought not to be protected by the law. And I've seen many people change their minds about this over time. In fact, maybe the most dramatic example of this was Bernard Nathanson himself, the founder of NARAL, did an abortion on his own child. He had a total conversion of heart, wrote a book called The Hand of God, and became maybe the strongest pro-life activist and public intellectual we've ever had in the movement. More recently, you may have been aware of Dr. Christian Collier at the University of Michigan Medical School. She was given the honor of doing the keynote address for their white coat ceremony, and it got out that she was pro-life before then, and a bunch of people walked out on her during that ceremony. One of the reasons that happened was because she wrote an article that I interviewed her for at the Pillar. I wrote an article, a Q&A with her at the Pillar, detailing her own conversion on these stories. She was very much a anti-theist, abortion supporter until the last 5 or 6 years, where she had a change of heart and is now a pro-life warrior. And I have actually, post her story, I have lots of hope that maybe the kind of antagonistic culture that is pushed so many pro-lifers to the corners in those clinical contexts we can have finally some more honest conversation about that. But again, it came about because of God's grace turning somebody's heart. And so I do think we ought to be evangelical about this. But in addition to that, we need to work to find common ground with people that we disagree with. And there is a lot, especially if we're going in the 3.0 direction. I've heard so many pro-lifers over the last several months talk about things in serious ways, like paid family leave, help with hopelessly expensive childcare, which many families now spend more on childcare than they do on their kids' college education. More labor protections at work based on family status. And I've been trying to push more housing, especially for women at risk for intimate partner violence. If you really think about the fact that abortion and intimate partner violence correlate so strongly together, we need to get women safe. We need to get women safe. It's one of the things I love about what the Sisters of Life do in New York. They do get a small number of women safe, and that's beautiful, but the problems are obviously way bigger than that. We need resources, we need housing, we need systems and structures to change. And I'll even see housing and go even bigger and talk about the whole labor process itself. Can professors be that out of touch and hope that that can change too? Well, my basis for saying so is I want to align myself with St. John Paul II in his great social encyclical Laborem Exercens, where he said the following, quote, "The whole labor process must be organized and adapted in such a way as to respect the requirements of the person and his or her forms of life. The true advancement of women requires that labor should be structured in such a way that women do not have to pay for their advancement by abandoning what is specific to them at the expense of the family, in which women as mothers have an irreplaceable role." Can we work together to restructure labor so that women do not have to pay for their advancement by abandoning their situation in the family as mothers? Speaking just brutally honestly here from my own family situation, we have 3 older adopted children and a surprise 4-year-old at home. My wife would really like to be at home more with the children, but she can't be because our labor system is not set up in such a way for that to be the case. And we have spent years trying to think about how we might do things differently to make this work in a very expensive place to live, as you might imagine. We live in the metropolitan area of New York City, so in New Jersey. So here's one thing we can focus on together: changing structures so that women don't feel that they have to choose between their role as mother and their role in the labor force and their other kind of role in different kinds of vocations they may be called to. But what about the church itself? That's a big question to ask about public policy. I was just discussing before coming over here for the talk about the fact that 1 in 7 beds, healthcare beds in the United States, is in a Catholic institution. What can we do as Catholic healthcare institutions? We can do a lot, right? We can do a lot. We have the institutions, we have the resources to do a lot. What about the level of the diocese? I can tell you Cardinal Dolan, who I work closely with on his pro-life commission, after something called the Reproductive Health Act was passed in New York, which basically made New York a champion of abortion, he called a press conference with the Sisters of Life and said, "Any woman who wants to come to a church who's in a desperate situation, we will take care of you." And then asked our commission to make sure this was happening. Spoiler alert, it's not happening, right? Some good things are happening, but we don't have the resources, we don't have the manpower, we don't have the structures in place to do what Cardinal Dolan promised. We're working on it, we're trying to get there, but it's not happening the way it should. Dare I ask about the parish level, Father Baum? What can we do at the parish level? And of course, our own individual lives, right? Someday, each of us will come before God and ask to give an account of what we did as individuals, right? I remind my students that Jesus doesn't talk about hell very often, but when he does talk about it, it's almost always as a failure to aid the least among us, right? Maybe the classic example being Matthew 25. If we fail to care for and bring in and protect the most vulnerable and marginalized members of our culture, we will have to give an accounting for that. And we might say, Lord, when did we see you in the various levels of need? And he'll say, like Pope Francis said, I was that baby. That was me. And when we fail to protect and support those babies, we fail to protect and support Christ himself. I have more I could say here, but I think I'm just going to finish with this, and maybe more things can come out in question and answer. I just want to leave you with words from Scripture that at least I found so moving in the context of work about this that I decided to get them put on a little wooden plaque above my office at home. You've probably heard them many times, but I think in this context they're especially powerful. Let the little children come to me, and don't ever stop them, for the kingdom of God belongs to those such as these. Thank you. So I think we're going to have a question and answer that Sister and I will both field questions for. As I said, I'll be happy to stay after the formal question and answer session as long as we reasonably can. But I think Father mentioned that we'll go probably till about, if we have enough questions, till about 7:15 or so, and then we'll cut it off there.
So if you do have a question, I invite you to come forward to the microphone and offer that question. There's even doesn't have to be something that was discussed already tonight. There's a lot of, I think, lingering questions that people have, confusion out there. Now is the opportunity to get some clarity on that. So I would appreciate you come forward to the microphone.
My understanding is that Joe Biden years ago was pro-life, and now it seems like he's changed to being supporting women's access to health services, which some interpret maybe as abortion services. And he had a meeting with the Pope, and the Pope, Biden said, the Pope told me to keep receiving communion, even though some clergy in the U.S. have denied communion to those that favor abortion. So your reactions or reconciling of that, you know, Biden's statements versus some clergy saying no communion to people of that nature. Thank you.
I have strong opinions about this, but let me preface them by saying, though I appreciate your question and where it comes from, it's somewhat unfortunate that the first question dealt with politics, because I hope it came through very clearly in my talk that these I don't think should be political questions, partisan ideas, and the church's teaching on manifestly persisting in grave sin and receiving communion applies on many different issues, right? Not just abortion, and not just public policy about abortion, which is another set of things to think about, right? In fact, historically, in this country, one of the greatest examples of excommunication and denying communion took place in New Orleans during the Civil Rights era, where Archbishop Rummel excommunicated 3 Catholics because they wouldn't integrate Catholic schools. And it was always not an attempt to punish someone, right? It was an attempt to say you are manifestly participating in grave sin and you are outside of this community and we want to welcome you back into the community, and this is kind of like our way to try to help do that. Pope Francis is right. It's not a prize for the perfect. Communion is not a prize for the perfect. He's right about that. But there's a difference between saying that and saying somebody who manifestly persists over time in grave sin and that. Those are two different things. And to be honest with you, I wish we'd talk about this more often in other contexts other than abortion. We should talk about it when it comes to abortion. Obviously, it's a great, you know what I think about it, it's a great evil given what I just said here. But I do share the concern that if we're only talking about it when it comes to abortion, it could seem political, right? It could seem as if, oh, we know what this is from the church. It's only Joe Biden that gets called out for these things, right? So what I'm about to say, this is all prefacing what I'm about to say about your actual question, which is, this is not a punishment. This is about trying to welcome people back in the community who are outside the community, and it's absolutely not political. That said, Joe Biden has directly supported legislation that would put the United States, again, maybe close to China or maybe above China in terms of our support for abortion. So there's no ambiguity about what he's proposed. And if Archbishop Rummel was right to excommunicate Catholic school superintendents or principals for not integrating schools in New Orleans, I think we just have to do the math here. But I have some hesitation to say it still based on what I said before. This is not political, right? This is not about the Democratic Party or Republican Party or Joe Biden versus Trump or some other thing that's going on here. In fact, when those things infect our discussion about this, we really risk idolatry, making an idol out of secular politics in a way that undermines the full message of the gospel. At least that's my view. I don't know if, Sister, you have something you want to follow up.
No, I agree. We need to, I always say it starts here. It starts with me. How do I see things? And the Catholic Church in its magnificence is merciful. But on the other hand, we have to be a witness to truth. And so I think you spoke very well. Joe Biden is not being a witness to truth. And how the Catholic Church deals with that and that balance between mercy and truth. But each of us have to take that on ourselves. And I would agree the conversation starts with us, and then it goes to the parish level, and then it goes to the city level. I myself have to seek the truth, and then I have to act in the truth and witness to that. And certainly Joe Biden is not witnessing to that. So
I thought of one other thing, too, that would be a helpful teaching point, maybe, too, on another related topic. There are, John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, his great encyclical on the Gospel of Life, was very clear. Catholic politicians are allowed to support policies that less than fully articulate or defend the Church's teaching on a number of issues for prudential reasons, right? Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. So for instance, if all we can pass in Michigan, for instance, or I'll put it in New Jersey to take it out of the politics here, if all we can pass in New Jersey is a 22-week ban, the Church would say, go ahead and support it. John Paul II would say, go ahead and support that, even though that's not what the law should be. Prudentially speaking, that's what we can do in the state of New Jersey. Joe Biden could have made an argument earlier in his career, and he was explicitly a pro-life Democrat for much of his life. And I think the fact that the whole idea of a pro-life Democrat has gone by the wayside, at least at the national level, is one of the great tragedies of the development of our politics in the last several years. But at an earlier point in his career, he could have made a case, I think, that says, listen, I'm wrestling with that prudential judgment here. I think, and he has said, he was interviewed in America Magazine, he said, I think life begins at conception. I believe the Church is teaching on this. He said that explicitly. And that's his argument. He says, I'm just making this prudential judgment about how to figure out, what the law should be. And maybe in the 80s and even the 90s, I would disagree with how he thinks about that. But I think you could make a plausible case that's what he was doing. But now, there's just no argument left to be made, right? He supports some of the most extreme legislation around.
I'm going to back up a minute to, I think Mississippi was trying to define when life began as the heartbeat. But truly, we Catholics, we Christians, believe that life begins at conception, because that's when God provides the soul. And if we could just settle that issue, I think that would solve the problem. So what are your thoughts on
I'd actually like to
when
interest.
life begins? When is a true life that God created? When does that happen?
I would like to answer that question because there's an endocrinologist who has done the whole biology of this, and it's an amazing thing because when there can be thousands of sperms swimming around the egg, and at the moment that one sperm crosses this one barrier called the zona pellucida, there's a chemical reaction. There's a chemical reaction that closes the door to all other sperm. That's a live, changing chemical. Even before the DNA from the sperm joined the DNA of the egg, there's a closing of that egg. So that endocrinologist took it even further back, which I wouldn't, but at the point where there's a chemical reaction, life begins. But then the DNA join, and then we believe that the soul is given at the moment that the DNA join. So, I mean, there are endocrinologists out there that are saying that not only is it at the point of conception, it's to the point of a chemical reaction. So, yes, I mean, but how to convince our fellow brothers and sisters that that's the truth? I mean, how do we convince them that, when you, again, dealing with, ideologies of faith, our faith is so much a part of our life that for us to believe that the soul comes at that point. But what about people who don't believe in God and don't believe in the soul? And you could still answer the question just by biology alone, I think. You could then at least say, well, the heartbeat, you could at least say, so by just the science of it, even if you didn't believe in God, now for us, for me, it's impossible not to believe that God gives the soul at that point of conception. But I think we could argue it from just a humanistic point of medical science also. But you're correct, yeah.
To that, I'd just add, this is just my experience. I don't know if you've had this experience too. There are at least two very distinct ways of knowing, and two distinct ways people kind of engage information, and just, crudely we might say via the head and via the heart, or the spirit maybe. My experience is, and this is bad for professors who like to argue in the head, very few people, in my experience, change their mind based on head stuff. I spent decades trying to convince people of what you just said, and intellectually I think they understand it, I think they get it, but it doesn't really move them, it doesn't really change their mind. This is only my experience, maybe others have had different experiences. And but when they think about a heart beating, or the pain a baby can feel, right, prenatally, that tends, in my experience, to connect more to the heart stuff and can maybe move people in different ways. And if we're trying to make prudential movement on this issue, because I agree 100% with what you said, right? Human life begins at conception. That's the way it is for fertilization, actually. Fertilization. I was just on a debate at the Catholic Medical Association's annual meeting on embryo adoption. We were trying to try to figure out what to do with these millions of embryos in frozen storage right now who are in this horrible state of not being alive, not being dead, but just like what to do with them. It's just horrific. Those are people. Those are enslaved people. But if we're talking about winning the culture, if we're talking about preaching the gospel, if we're trying to talk about winning hearts and minds, and this is just my own experience, I find it easier to talk about a heartbeat, pain thresholds, stories about fetal surgeries, even though if it doesn't go all the way back to fertilization.
I know you touched on this, but either I didn't hear it all, but how does the Catholic Church feel or teach about, say, a 12-year-old that has been raped and is now pregnant, or an adult woman who's raped and now pregnant or comes from an abusive relationship? Is there any protection for them, or does this 12-year-old have to have this baby?
I might just speak into that from my own experience. I've taken care of 13-year-olds that have had babies, been pregnant, and I've taken care of 13-year-olds who have had abortions. Mm-hmm. And from a physician's perspective, the one that had the abortion has a lifelong wound. That woman, when she then starts to have children, she remembers even at a 13-year-old. The one that had the baby, it was an inconvenience. They could give it up for adoption, or they might have even, usually the parents take care of it, or they give it up for adoption. But that woman, I've talked to them as adults, and they have a lot less lifelong wounds. So as a physician, I want to look and I want to say, what is the best outcome for this person? So it's not just, do they have a right, the best outcome is that they not experience that abortion because of the deep psychologically wounded experience that, I'm dealing with 40 and 50-year-olds who start crying in my office remembering an abortion when they were a teenager. So still carrying that their whole life, carrying that. When my mother made me, my boyfriend made me, I wished I wouldn't have. Once I had my first child, I realized what I did. So I do think that you look at, say, yes, rape is a terrible thing at any age. I have a 17-year-old in my practice right now, who'll be delivering soon, and she's a happy-go-lucky kid. She's not going to raise that child, but she's going to be much better off having taken that child to birth, and then she'll get on with her life. But so just seeing it from that perspective, do the best you can to cause the least harm, and I do believe the least harm, even in situations of rape, is for the woman to have the baby.
It just seems that the people that bring this up, to me anyway, it's a lot. And that's why they're for abortion, because what if this would happen to your 12-year-old? What would you would have to follow through and let her have this baby, and that's just not right. So
yeah, they do use the extreme cases.
That's a difficult thing to answer to somebody.
I do think it's true that people use with this ideology, they use the extreme example. Rape is always the extreme
course, it's probably way in the minority.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as percentage-wise, as to how many 12-year-olds get raped.
There's a speaker who's a speaker in the pro-life industry, and he was a botched abortion, and he lived, and he became a good writer and stuff, and he has this one film that says, that describes him, describes all of his success. He's a father, and he's a writer, and he's this, and he's this, and he's this, and he's this, and he said, and I was a botched abortion. I would not have existed, but here's a human being that had a fruitful life. Mm-hmm. So it is true they use the worst case scenario to prove their point. Yeah. And how are you going to convince them of other? I don't know. That's yours.
Well, they use it. They use it to vote. They use it to vote yes and agree. That's what they're doing. So.
Yeah, this is something these were part of my remarks I decided to leave off, and because I knew there would be a question about it. There almost always is. I think it's important to address, though, and we've already said some very, very, very helpful things. To that, I'd also add there are also pro-life speakers who they themselves were conceived in rape, right? So they were children conceived in rape who now go around the country speaking on these questions. And so you have, again, this unbelievably difficult, pregnancy, and then after pregnancy, I mean, you have these two people, right? And any time that we lose sight of the fact that there are two people, we're missing something important. And so if we just talk about sexual violence, which we should, and we should not paper over, and we should do a much better job of addressing sexual violence, intimate partner violence, violence towards women in general. Did you know that one of the most common ways a pregnant woman dies is by homicide? So women face this violence, girls face this violence. We ought not to paper over that. We ought not to dismiss it. You probably heard some politicians say things like, oh, if people get raped, their whole body shuts that thing down, they can't get pregnant. Maybe that happened just, like I think 3 or 4 election cycles ago. It's just a disaster, right? 2 people, treating them equally means we treat both. But then there's the other side of it, right? There is a baby. And these babies grow up, and sometimes they give pro-life talks, and they say, well, what about me, right? Do I not count here? Do I get erased from this conversation because of this other story? Now, let me say this. Again, the church allows and even encourages prudential judgments to be made about things like rape exceptions. So if you can't get a law passed in Michigan or New Jersey without a rape exception, then you should have a rape exception. So you could pass the bill, right? There's prudential judgment there. That's not punting on the church's teaching on this any more than passing the 22-week bill in New Jersey punts on the 21 or 20-week-old baby, right? That's just what you have to do as a matter of prudential judgment to protect as many babies as you can, support as many women as you can with the law.
Hi, my name is Carol Ahrens, and I don't know if you ever heard, actually another problem that the church may be facing too is the problem of abortion survivors. I've known a number of them in my life, and it's like there's such joy. I mean, I got to know one of them through a local Christian nightclub, and it's like they came within feet of having been aborted. And it was just a matter of somebody being there that morning that made all the difference. So, and also too, I don't know if you ever watched the movie Unplanned, but that actually too was another case where, the lead actress in that, her name was Ashley Brasher, and she was an abortion survivor. She came within minutes of having been aborted. And if you think about that movie too, it's about the life of Abby Johnston, who was herself a former abortion provider. So here you have 2 women at opposite ends of this whole situation, and they're coming together. And if you think about that too, I mean, isn't that what Jesus is all about? His forgiveness and his mercy is all about. If you look at the lives of these 2 women.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about his most precious body and blood, he brings he brings these 2 together. The former abortion provider and also the could have been abortion victim. If you think about his presence, most holy presence in the Eucharist.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. It is wonderful that we see conversions. I mean, that gives us hope, right? We see amazing conversions that people then give their whole life to evangelize. Mm-hmm. And so that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. That's what we want to see. We want to see conversions, and it happens, one at a time. We want to see it.
Mm-hmm. But I would say at the church, we have his message to bring to these abortion survivors too. Because actually, I know another one I just got to know recently, and he was actually suicidal. And it's like in the whole in reality of surviving an abortion procedure, having survived, and it played a role.
Yeah.
So we need to address that.
Thank you so much.
I have 2 questions from the back. One addressing something you brought up in your talk about the most pro-life people being people living in poverty, yet at the same time the most abortions happening in those communities. And they wanted to see if you could explain that, why that's happening. And then second of all, I got a question about atopic pregnancies, if you could address those.
Yeah, so one of the most pernicious things about our ridiculously high abortion rate is the pro-choice rhetoric about women kind of adding up the benefits and the burdens and thinking about it really hard and like spitting out a decision like a calculator or a computer is not at all how any of this works in real life. In real life, there are women who go to the abortion clinic, and if you ask them what's happening, they understand it's the killing of their child. What kind of desperate circumstance must you find yourself in if that's what's happening? And happening again and again and again, even for the same person. Even for the same person. Now, we already know one thing, right? Intimate partner violence. There's often a man who says, if you don't get this abortion, I'm going to kick the crap out of you. And you're going to be out on the street, and your kids will be out on the street, and you're done, right? You're homeless with 3 or 4 kids, maybe. And so you can imagine what that might do. And then poverty, right? So most abortions are procured by women who already have children, sometimes several children. And they find themselves in a situation where they're basically like, I don't know how I'm going to take care of my family, right? You can talk about adoption. I was just at a conference at Catholic University of America in DC a couple days ago on adoption after Dobbs. We need to redouble our efforts to make people aware about that, but there's a tremendous amount of stigma associated with that, kind of a failure, giving, even the language we use, giving the child up for adoption, doesn't exactly send a great message about what might be happening there. But then for opponents of pro-lifers to get on social media and get on cable news shows and say things like, I support abortion because I care about economically vulnerable people of color. You do not care about economically vulnerable people of color. If we did, we would be retooling our culture, as I mentioned earlier, our labor and social safety net and everything, so that these women could actually choose life, right? Which is what they want to do. And to get back to my point about pro-life 3.0, we are now in a position where pro-lifers can demand of our politicians that they do that, to say, okay, the three-legged stool is broken, we're not bound to libertarians anymore, let's figure out how we're going to support these women the way that they need to be supported. So protect prenatal justice, but also change the social structures as well. At least that's my view.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the poor women, and many of my patients are poor, they really suffer with the pressure from outside. They want their children, actually. And so that's a double suffering for them. The one suffering is that they're poor, and that there's so much pressure from everyone to abort the baby because they're poor. So they feel guilty because they're poor, and they don't want to have the abortion, and so there's a double kind of whammy there. And so how would we invite our society to be able to allow the poor women want to have children, because actually it brings them joy. It's the one they can have nothing around them, and they have this little baby. I see it in my office. They have this little baby, and that's their joy. And so it brings joy into their poverty. And I've seen other women who have had several abortions who said, all I ever wanted was children. And I do infertility work. So then finally maybe they get stable in their life, and they're in their 35, and they're ready to have children by society standards because they've been poor, and now they could possibly have a child. They've wanted all these children. And then they can't get pregnant, and they feel like God is punishing them. So I mean, these are women who are poor, who are suffering, but the society is adding to their suffering. They have enough suffering, and society is adding to their suffering. So I would agree, if there's any way that we could retool the social structure to be able to support poor women who want to have children. They care more about having the children than they care about their poverty in many cases. How we can help them to relieve their suffering at many levels.
And as church too, right?
Yeah.
So you're doing wonderful work as church, obviously, and Sisters of Life and others, but we need an all hands on deck approach here as church to mobilize in this way too. So it's not just about voting for the right people or supporting the right policies, though those things are ridiculously important. It's about what we can do. And Father, you mentioned something about ectopic pregnancy. Did you want?
I think just if you could address that.
You want?
Well, an ectopic pregnancy, so you understand, is a pregnancy that's in the fallopian tubes. That's a non-viable pregnancy, and that puts the mother's life at risk. So, you can explain double effect, but it's a non-viable pregnancy. And if the baby will grow in the fallopian tube to a point where it ruptures the fallopian tube is very vascular, so the woman can bleed. This is an emergency room in the ER. So they define, what happens is the woman goes to the ER and she has a positive pregnancy test. They do an ultrasound and find that the pregnancy is in the fallopian tubes. And it truly is an emergency to save the mother's life. Now the double effect kind of.
Yeah, so there's this very sort of fundamental principle in Catholic moral theology called the principle of double effect, which I think we kind of all maybe instinctually know in our lives. There's a difference between a terrorist who directly attacks innocent people and intends to kill innocent people, and say a U.S. bomber who is trying to avoid civilian casualties but foresees but does not intend that maybe he might kill some innocent civilians as part of bombing a legitimate target. You might think it's still wrong or right, but we at least think of as there being a big moral difference between those two acts, even if they end up with dead civilians in both cases. Something similar happens in medicine as well with the principle of double effect. As long as you're not aiming at the death of the child, right, intending to kill the child, you can do all sorts of things to save the mother's life that are not considered violence according to Catholic teaching because of the principle of double effect. If your aim is to kill the child, then we got a different set of questions to ask, just as if your aim is to kill an innocent person as a terrorist or in some other context. It's something similar actually is very prescient at the end of life. So the church would say it's perfectly fine to discontinue chemotherapy or give somebody a very large dose of pain medication, even if you foresee but don't intend that death will be sped up as a result of this, but no direct killing of the innocent. That's an intrinsically evil act and never morally permitted. So the example of a tubal pregnancy, there is some debate about whether you can actually remove the embryo or if you need to take out the whole fallopian tube. But in general, the idea is as long as you're not aiming at the death of the baby, it's not only permitted, it's like done all the time in Catholic hospitals to save the baby's life. Something similar actually would happen if, say, a mother got cancer of the uterus, a pregnant woman got cancer of the uterus, and they needed to do a hysterectomy to save her life, or she chose to do that, and you foresee again, but don't intend that if it's before viability, the baby doesn't have a chance to survive. Another thing that Catholic social teaching not only permits, but happens all the time in Catholic hospitals.
I have a specific question about the RU-486 pill. Here in Lansing, we have a really active group of people who stand out by our Planned Parenthood all day long, all week long, and the Planned Parenthood passes out the RU-486 pill. So I'm wondering what percentage of pregnancies or abortions are done with the pill, and how far into pregnancy is the pill effective for?
This is complicated. They call it a chemical pregnancy termination. And unfortunately, it is impossible to measure because women can get this through the internet. They can get it very easily, and there's no way to document how many lives are lost through chemical abortions. But we think it's a very high number, and it will become even higher as the physical abortions, the medical abortions, decrease, there'll be more chemical abortions.
Our Planned Parenthood does only gives out the pill. They don't do abortion.
That's because it's illegal to
at
do
our
abortions.
Planned Parenthood. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's becoming, and it, you can have it mailed, then they'll have to start working on regulations of mailing this through the
After
Yeah.
the amendment passes.
There's a lot to work on
If it
chemical
passes.
abortions. There's a lot of work to be done in the pro-life industry on chemical abortions because there's going to be a lot more of them now. That, to answer your question, at what point do they not work? That's a little bit variable because it's hard to sometimes time the pregnancy. So they're supposed to be, within the first, few weeks, and how it works. It's very different than the morning after pill, so we're not talking about
Right.
the morning after pill.
Right.
Okay. So, and women don't time their pregnancy because a lot of women don't really think about their menstrual periods. This is part of, I think, the pro-life mentality is let's get women to appreciate their fertility so that they're kind of aware, well, I should be having my period and I've missed my period. Many times women are like several weeks and it's like, when was my last period? I can't remember. And so the dating of their pregnancy, so I've had women at my clinic who took the chemical abortion and it didn't work. And then I was able to convince them that this was God's child and, would you like to carry it to term and we can help you in whatever way we can. So I think there are a sufficient number of women who failed the chemical abortion and end up going either to term or having a medical abortion. But this is something the pro-life industry really has to work on. But I think it's, again, if you go back to the person themselves, I don't think we're doing a very good, because I work with infertility, I don't think we're doing a very good job of helping women appreciate their fertility. Getting it in the school systems. What are we, we're teaching, they learn in science class how to put condoms on a banana. But, who's teaching them the beauty, the magnificence of the fertility system? Who's teaching them about their period, to appreciate their period, that it's not something to dread, the dreaded time, So I think we just have to do back up to try to evangelize the magnificence of fertility and get women to appreciate it. So when I teach natural family planning, women are just like, really? And men are even more excited. I always bring make sure if I'm teaching a couple that the husband comes in, they're like, wow, I didn't know that. And they fall in love with their wife's body all the more. So getting an evangelization to appreciate fertility is a very deeper effort so that then we can somehow back off on these chemical abortions. What do you have to say about chemical abortions?
I almost don't want to say anything because that was so beautiful, but because I'm a professor, I will. So I think Sister's right, we don't know exactly how many, but the best estimates I think out there are about half of all abortions now are chemical.
That's what we've heard, that
Yeah.
up to 70% of the ones that are Planned Parenthood could be.
And in some ways it's really bad in some ways, but in some ways it's hopeful because one thing it signals is pro-lifers have been really effective over the last 50 years in convincing lots of people, including clinicians, including OBGYNs, to not do abortions. Most OBGYNs don't do abortions. Even those that say they're pro-choice, they don't do them. This is one way to get around that, obviously, right? But let me emphasize this. This might be, I don't know if we have to finish now, Father, if you want one more, but as much as we need to focus so hard on protecting babies with the law, I want to see them protected by the Constitution, right? By an amendment, ideally. But what is happening now with RU46 and illegal trafficking of pills indicates that even if we get that, there's going to be so many illegal abortions via RU46. Like you said, it might be up to 70, 80%. Who knows how high we might get? That we are going to have to focus on changing the culture too. It's not going to be just about making it illegal or something. Let's wash our hands and go home with this. There were already illegal abortions happening, but can you imagine what they're going to be like with this now?
Well, and when I looked it up and Googled it, of course, to get information, most all of the articles agreed that it was effective up through the 14th week of pregnancy. So that's...
Was there a story recently about a teenager who was forced to take it by her mom, like well into the 20th week? I think I heard even that too. But anyway, yeah, it's effective. It depends what you mean and the risk. Another thing that's not emphasized is just how risky it is and how you really need a physician to really walk you through this. And yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah, I mean, the movie Unplanned, as you mentioned, displays that very well, where they give the woman the pill and she goes home and bleeds for days.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I hear it in my office. I
Right,
hear it. They
because
come in,
I'm
they're
sure
anemic,
there's
they're
horror
bled for
stories.
days, they've cramped, they've been
Right.
all alone in the bathroom with no help. It is very sorrowful.
Yeah.
So, and women might pick up on that. They don't want to do that because they're hearing among, oh no, I did that and this is what happened to me, it was awful. So it's getting along the grapevine that this is really awful. So I don't know, it's a big hurdle. That's our next big hurdle, but changing the culture individually, starting in grade school, teaching women to appreciate their fertility, teaching men to appreciate the fertility of a woman.
It's a wonderful message.
I think we need to go back that far and re-evangelize our culture.
Yeah. Yay. Thank you.
We want to respect your time. It's 7:15 now, so we'll say a word of thanks and allow if you want to go. But if you would like to stay and remain, if you have questions that haven't been answered yet, Sister and Doctor will stay here and answer some questions. So, but thank you so very much for your coming. Pro-Life 3.0, I like that. We had a lot of work to do. We thank Sister Maria Paul for being here with us today. Thank her and her religious community, the RSM sisters, for the work that you guys do in this community. We thank you. And Dr. Charlie Camosy, thank you for coming here, spending time away from your family to come all the way to Michigan to be with us today. So we appreciate both of you very much. Let's give them a round of applause. The Lord be with you.
With your spirit.
May Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Go and announce the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Again, thank you for coming. If you'd like to stay and ask some more questions, you're welcome to do so.
Pleasure working with you. Were these here or are these yours? I'm going to take I think they were for us. Great job, boy. Love to hear more of your stuff. I work too hard to keep up.
Yeah, no kidding.
I can't keep up with the bioethics because I'm working.